Unconventional Soldier, a military podcast brought to you by two British Army veterans in association with ISARR.com.
Welcome everyone, and thanks for downloading another episode of the podcast. This is our Christmas film special, and it's been hosted by our resident cultural critic, Simon Vincent, all the way from New Zealand. It's great to have you on the pod, Simon. So, what have you got planned for us today?
Kia ora koutou. Thanks very much, Kevin and Colin, for having me along. Well, I thought, it is towards the end of the year, and I thought we could try something a little bit different and talk about some of the favourite films that we watched, and maybe reflect a little on why they resonated with us in the troop and the battery over our times. But first, I think before we press play on the movies, we need to set the scene a little bit. The three of us all joined the OP troop when it was part of the British Army of the Rhine. This was in the days before TripAdvisor and the like. Everything outside the gates in Germany was a bit foreign to us. When we went out in Dortmund, it was to drink in the squaddy bars with other squaddies, or do our Dobie, or stock up on kit to make our life in the field more bearable. We were not exactly cultural explorers, making the most of Nordrhein-Westfalen's museums, cathedrals, and scenic hotspots. Let's face it, we struggled to cope with the culture shock of mayo on Fritz in the local Schnellimbiss.
Still got the German though, Simon. Good to see it.
Yeah, I've not lost it. but looking back on the time, I do feel I missed out on a lot of the opportunities that now, as a pretty well-cultured gentleman, I would have seized upon. How do you two look back on our days in Germany?
I think you've got to look it through what was available. As you said earlier, there was no Netflix, there was nothing. So, and we're pretty. I think it's just immaturity, isn't it? In some respects. The biggest cultural thing we did was go to the Monazee Dam and sing the Dam Busters tune and run along it after a few beers.
I think also we were isolated away from the community a little bit, and you did feel that as well because of the way that the camps were structured. Your social network was always going to be inside the camps. It was always difficult, and obviously we enjoyed going back to the UK for leave, and then we'd all meet up in the UK. But yeah, we were very an isolated group.
And you couldn't get in a lot of the bars as well, if you remember. That's why you use that term squaddy bar. Because a lot of the pubs just wouldn't let you in.
No, and in the early days, in early to mid 80s, we weren't really welcomed in a lot of places, even the more cultural places that we didn't try to get into.
Yeah. It's funny. I was thinking back as well on how I remember there used to be a German language course for people as they entered service over there, but that was limited as well. It wasn't as if they really pushed for us to integrate any better. But like you say, we couldn't get in half of the bars, and then when we went back on leave into the UK, we couldn't get in half of them either. So maybe there was a reason behind it all.
I blame the Germans, Simon. It's dead easy to blame the Germans.
Yeah, but when we were spending our time in BAOR, if we were not on operations, exercises, or training, a large proportion of our time was spent in barracks, in our rooms, living with the people we worked with. The NAFI or the PRI shops had provided us with kettles, stereo systems, TV, and a video player. The British Forces Broadcasting Service was only offering very limited programming, so videos rented from the NAFI offered us a form of escape from the routine of our in-camp life. The video. It was all VHS back then, no access to streaming services. The limited movies we did have access to got watched over and over again, and generally with the same mates making the same comments over and over again. The movies themselves, I think, became a big part of our routine, and as might be expected of a bunch of squaddies, films with a military angle or at least weapons or explosions or the like were a big part of our playlist.
Yeah, I think we can touch on that later on, Simon, but I think because any soldier wants to go in operations, and if you can't go in operations for real, I think you go in operations through films.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's it. We sort of, it was the sort of busman's holidays to a degree where we're watching what the movie world portrays as life that we're supposedly leading to some extent. But well, let's discuss some of those films, and I've loosely grouped them as the Golden Oldies, Hollywood epics, Close to Home, Vietnam, and now for something completely different. So let's start with the Golden Oldies. These are predominantly covering World War II. The actors all had very much the BBC accent. Often the films were essentially reenactments of an actual event that took place during the war, with a few changes to keep post-war morale high. I'm talking films like The Battle of Britain, Dam Busters, In Which We Serve. Do they touch a chord with you guys?
I think 70s, we're all 70s kids, aren't we? And you think back on it now, well, we grew up in the 70s, weren't born in the 70s. But I think back in then, all the veterans from the Second World War would have been about our age now. And Britain back in the 70s was obsessed with 1939 to 45 for some reason.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think when I first joined, I went to France with D-Day veterans, and they were only 60 odd years old, and they took us through, obviously, where they landed and everything else. And you forget that actually, they were old men, a little bit older than we are. In fact, a lot older than me, obviously. But their memories and then I watch things like The Longest Stay, because then you'd have exactly the same. Or you'd watch World at War.
Yeah.
World at War was all that real footage. Yeah, I found out. We forget how big an event World War II was. We're never going to understand that because we didn't live through it.
I also think it's the last time that Britain during the 70s probably perceived it did something well. Because the 1970s Britain economically wasn't doing too well, and we were the sick man of Europe. And I think it was a sort of a harking back to a golden age when things were a bit clearer and Britain was doing okay.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I always remember is a lot of these films were shown, as I was growing up, were shown on a Sunday afternoon. So you'd kind of you'd have had your big lunch. You're in front of the TV watching one of these films, and they must have sort of struck a sort of chord with the parents and the older generation watching them, harking back to the day. But for us, there was probably just, a bit of action and adventure at the time, and we were seeing them. But it's funny because I, look back at a few of them, and, we've mentioned Dam Busters already, and how, that was, I guess the story of a film like Dam Busters was quite simple in a way. There's a problem or a perceived problem. There's this heavy industry. It's got to be stopped, but how do you carry out the task? So the film follows that line of coming up, experimentation, practice, giving it a go, and then to a final conclusion. And I think it was also part of that. I wouldn't say jingoistic, but it was putting a powerful message that, we as a nation achieved something. And I think as well, one of the other things that struck me was, a lot of the actors had possibly served as well.
Yeah, Richard Todd.
He dropped in D-Day, didn't he, Richard Todd?
Yeah, he was seven para. Not RHA, but actually one of the 7 battalions. Yeah.
You're going to say proper parachute battalion.
For our listeners again. That's Colin.
Yeah,
me.
There you go. But it's funny as well that, again, of the time we were watching the movies, they existed in that context of other things that were available to us on TV. So now I look back and I think, all of the actors had very pronounced, what do they call it, RP accent, very, BBC accents. And anyone who and a lot of the characters were the officers. That was where most of the action centered around, and anyone who was another rank was probably someone with a BBC accent trying to do a Cockney accent or a comedy Northerner, and so it was a bit Dick Van Dyke if it wasn't, to be in a movie in those days, you probably had to be quite a high class.
Rada and all the rest.
Yeah. So he had that.
But Dan Bus is unusual, and it featured a civilian as well, and like Barnes Wallace, didn't it? Because he was pivotal. But interestingly, at the end of the film, I don't know if he says it in the film, but I know from reading books about it, he reckoned that he hadn't invented the bouncing bomb because the toll on the air crews. I think of the 19 aircraft, 8 of them were shot down.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's part of that framework of sort of. It's partly about morale, but it was partly about justification as well. All of these, the movies we've talked about here, while I don't think anyone would say World War II we shouldn't have been involved in any shape or form, but it was always there was always that sense of we want to show the public why we did these things. And some of them might at the times, even in the 70s, were there was a movement around CND was growing and things like that. So there was potentially some backlash to military at the time. But watching those films again at the time were probably a good way of showing. Look,
I also think, Simon. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. Well, we had a difficult task, and we achieved it as a nation.
When you touched on morals there, I think as well with the Dam Busters, it was the only film probably that could have been made about Bomber Command because the raid on the dams was pretty clean. All right, I don't say this glibly, but only a few thousand civilians were killed. And it was against a specific target. Where you compare that to the area bombing and the firestorm in Hamburg, where tens of thousands of people were killed. And even in the 70s and just after the war, Bomber Command never got a medal for their campaign because the whole moral side of area bombing, even just after the war, was up for debate.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just another one. I was doing a wee bit of research for this, and one that struck me was talking of aircraft was the Battle of Britain. So that came out in 1969, and about one of the biggest expenses was getting aircraft replicas or originals to actually be involved in the flying scene, and they basically said, just to make it look as realistic as they could, basically, nearly bankrupt the whole movie. The cost of the aircraft was more than the cost of everything else involved in the whole putting together of the production. And the guy who that all fell down to, the producer, was sort of at the end of it was left, well, I've got all these planes now, what am I going to do? But I guess he managed to sell them off to some enthusiasts afterwards.
They got a lot of Messerschmitts from Spain. Seemingly, I think those Spanish Air Force still have a load of Messerschmitts for some reason.
Yeah.
What year was that again? The film
69. It came out.
Well, it's still obviously Spain was still being run by
Franco. Yeah.
So he would have had a lot of German kit, probably.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going back to the cultural side, one thing the Brits always do is they always like to take the mickey out of themselves, about the war. And you look at things like Dad's Army, Hello, Hello. And just going back to the Dam Busters quickly, do you remember that Carling Black Label advert where you had the German goalkeeper on the Mornay Dam?
Yeah. No, but it's, I think that's one of the other things as well within all of these sort of films. There's always that little vignette of the a major character doing something a bit funny or a little mistake or or showing the home life and that side. So it was generally down the line. The movies were almost like a military operation. We've got to show this piece. We've got to do this. Then we'll do this. But we'll throw in a little bit of humanity at some point, and to catch everyone along. Yeah. All right. Should we move on to the next section?
Yeah.
So I've called these the Hollywood epics, and just like our patrols, these ones generally featured an all-star cast. These were the movies like Dirty Dozen, Great Escape, Where Eagles Stir, a personal favourite of mine, A Bridge Too Far. These films, I guess we're starting also to see a lot more plot and character-driven elements in these films. So, it wasn't, here's the story and we'll tell it almost like a government-made film. These were actually where they said, hang on, we've got some really top, actors here. Let's really put them out there to the public in full color CinemaScope. You're talking people like Charles Bronson, Telly Savalas, Lee Marvin, some big names of the time, Clint Eastwood, so real big, powerful names, and they all came together. A lot of these films were based around a sort of, a ragtag group of soldiers brought together for a particular mission. Yeah, very much like the OP Troop, I guess. I really, really have enjoyed watching some of those and just seeing how, it really took you on a journey, I guess. A lot of them did focus on getting that group together, training them up, and then will they succeed in the mission? Resonate with you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think, going back to what you were talking about earlier, Simon, 1950s black and white films about Britain's part in the war. 60s onwards, you start to see that shift where the tales told about the war are from an American perspective. A Bridge Too Far is definitely the American side of that operation, a lot of it as well, I think.
Yeah.
Well, The Great Escape, I mean, in the real Great Escape, there was no Americans involved.
Yeah. I guess that's it. It's where we are actually seeing. To get this film across the line, we need a bit of star power, and that's definitely what they did. But again, I always like watching things like The Dirty Dozen. I mean, there must have been a lot of truth behind that story. I don't know too much really about the truth of it, but I do know. So one of the things about The Dirty Dozen, they essentially took soldiers who were in prison, facing court-martial, in some cases potentially up for the firing squad, and gave them a suicide mission. You've got to be involved. If you survive this mission successfully, we'll give you immunity and things like that. So that was the plot. But I also know there was a lot of what was his name? Lucky Luciani, the American gangster who was flown into Sicily. So there was a lot of things where people were starting saying, well, actually, these people who are maybe not the best soldiers in terms of drill or how they're perceived as part of a unit may have some qualities that are useful. And I think a lot of these films try to portray the outsider element as well.
Do you not reckon as well, Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards, or Bastards, or however you pronounce it, owes a lot to The Dirty Dozen in that respect?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Be the magpie there.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's it. People like him have obviously quite often showcased some of their, where they got their ideas from. But mentioning the more modern version, and I must admit, I have not watched Saving Private Ryan, for instance, or
you haven't, seriously?
No. It was just one of those things. Wherever I was at the time, I didn't see. So, but how do you think that sort of older generation, if you like, of Hollywood epics stands up against some of the more modern version with the star power of these films?
I think Saving Private Ryan was a game changer in that opening scene. The downside is you get the feeling that the Americans were the only troops on D-Day, and the only British troops that get a mention is when a segment of the film they're slagging off Montgomery's effort and the British effort. But that opening scene in Saving Private Ryan, I mean, you can see it influenced everything after that came in its wake. Do you not think, Kev?
Yeah, I think probably my favourite, more than Saving Private Ryan, is Band of Brothers. Even though it's not a film, the serious Band of Brothers actually, it's raised the bar massively for sort of war films because the realism. I think they brought more realism into it. They've brought the horror as well, which I think maybe some of the classics avoided a lot of that. They didn't have the amputees on the beaches. They didn't have that sort of level of violence. It was there, but not the same because Hollywood. It's a family film, isn't it? One of the Great Escape is played every Christmas. It's a family film, and that sort of stuff. And that's what I think they pushed on. Plus, I think it was the era as well because the 60s and 70s. Obviously, America was in its Vietnam War, and they didn't want to show the horrors of war when they've got people being drafted and sent off to fight.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, you don't think about that, do you?
Yeah, they softened it maybe in that sort of way because during that period, the 60s and 70s, there's really no Vietnam films about the Vietnam War.
True. Yeah.
I mean, the other one I just want to quickly bring up is because during that period we're talking, there's not real many British films getting through all the Hollywood stuff, but Wild Geese got to be an absolute classic.
Yeah.
It's got the fattest, oldest mercenaries in the world.
But what's the classic line from his little lad? Oh, I'm so happy I could scream. I'll go on then. Yahoo! Yeah.
And then you've got the famous medic. Come on, my lovelies. He's taking on the Katanganese soldiers.
Yeah. But I think as well, it's as Kev mentions, Band of Brothers. I think that was another important part is they're going down into the the real human side of the story a little bit more, within those sort of productions because the big ones, it was all about getting an audience in, enjoy the time, eat the popcorn and get out. And I guess as we've moved on, there's a little bit more about let's get an audience to think a bit more. It's probably.
I also think you get a sense of scale from things like Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers. When you see that scene in Band of Brothers where they drop in, and there's a very clever shot where it comes out the aircraft through the door they're going to jump, the side door they're jumping through, and pans back, and you can see all the aircraft flying over the channel, and you get a real sense of scale of what it must have been like.
Yeah, I think one of those that stands out to me as well because of it's done very well in a few books I've read where they close in on an individual and they're saying this is the feelings. This is how this person's going through, this momentous occasion, and then it pans back and says, and there's thousands and thousands of others, in that moment in time as well. Yeah.
And the other thing people forget is, the main difference between the Allied forces and the German forces. Our forces, the Brits and Americans in the main, were citizens' armies. They weren't conscripted. Sorry, they were conscripted, but they were citizens' armies. So it wasn't like the Wehrmacht or the German forces, whereby it was a dictatorship. You had to go in. If you didn't do your job, you're executed. So even though Allied forces were conscripted, there was an element of democracy about it. You had to look after them. You couldn't just sacrifice them needlessly like they did in World War One. I think that's another thing that comes out in Band of Brothers. Those airborne guys were volunteers on top of a citizens' army.
Yeah.
I think there's also an element, to build on from that where, because, these were just regular people who were in an extreme situation, but that's how we now are able to look at them. But I think we touched upon this when we were talking about books in that, if someone was a prisoner of war, while all the glory goes to those who tried to escape and did that, but for so many people, it was I'm safe, I'm alive, and this is probably better than, it's better to sit here and sit out the war than anything else. And, again, fair play to them for, being in that situation anyway.
Absolutely, mate. So next section we're going to move on to?
Yeah, now I've called these close to home because I think these are the sort of movies that start to cover some of the conflicts that ourselves or our contemporaries would have actually been involved in. And it's sort of fairly broad range, really, but I've included the movie Who Dares Wins, Tumbledown from the Falklands, and Three Kings from the Gulf War. I always remember, and I just as the sort of bit of background on Who Dares Wins, it was kind of loosely based on the Iranian embassy siege that the SAS took part in 81. But I remember reading the book. Now, the book's called Tiptoe Boys, and the writer, James Follett, was a journalist who lived around the corner from the Libyan embassy, and he sort of said, wow, there's got to be a story in all this. It was at the, when the SAS were first becoming really in the public's attention because of this. And he decided to write. And as he was writing, he also let people know, what he was up to. And someone said, okay, we'll do, someone bought the rights and we'll make a movie of it. But what actually happened, he was writing it chapter by chapter. And as he wrote a chapter, it was flown off on Concorde, I think, to screenwriters in the States, and they were putting the production together at that time. So it was, as he was writing his novel, it was also being turned at the same time into a screenplay, which is quite unusual for filmmaking in itself. But it was, it was a film which I think anyone who watched it would have obviously got the connections to the Iranian embassy and things like that, which had probably just been on the news, literally a year or a few months prior to that movie coming out.
You look back on it now, and it's like bad TV movie now, I think. And certainly amongst the other films you're comparing it to there, it doesn't stand up very well at all.
And I think there's an element of that. I mean, Lewis Collins was the star, and he was, he came from that sort of TV, background in the Sweeney and the Professionals. And things like that. and so, it was probably making use of his status to make a movie. But absolutely, it's probably wrong to say it's comical to look back. It's like everything; things are of their time, I think, when you look back. But it was interesting to see something so.
But Lewis Collins, Sorry. Lewis Collins, I don't know if you know, he served with Para.
Yeah, that's right.
And did P Company, and he was going to go for either 2-1 or 2-3 SAS. But because he had a high-profile public image, he wasn't allowed to. And I was reading a couple of things online about Lewis Collins, and he's quite well regarded. There's a couple of his DS in the parachute regiment at the time had wrote in saying he was a good soldier and pretty fit.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those things that, of his time. He's probably one of those who, well, from everything I've seen of him, an opportunity came up to be a star. And he jumped at that, but if things had gone other ways, he would, he looks like he would have been, yep, I'm going in the military. That's the path for me. But red carpets, champagne, and all that. Yeah, probably was a choice.
Stuck in a trench, crapping in plastic bags.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think also is of the time as well, because the 80s, especially the early 80s, late 70s, and Colin mentioned it earlier. It was quite a depressing time in the UK, high unemployment. We needed good news stories. So the Iran embassy was a good news story, and the film came at the right time. It was a bolster to the British psyche, perhaps, to make us all feel a little bit better about ourselves, because there wasn't a lot of good news at the time.
Yeah, well, I did read one review that basically said it was a Conservative Party political campaign as such. It was almost, it was too good to be true for a sort of a government at the time. To show that. Another one, and again of reflecting a similar time of when it was set, but came out in 88, was Tumbledown, which was Colin Firth. I guess that was one of his first real, came into the public's consciousness, and this was based around a guardsman in the Falklands who was injured and came home, and I guess it was controversial in that it was starting to show someone's feelings after a conflict, and a feeling that it made a big thing of saying that we weren't looked after when we returned.
It's probably worth pointing out though, Simon, the character it's based on, Lieutenant Robert Lawrence, he was shot in the head just during the reorganisation phase of the battle, and he lost something like a cup full of his brain. And when he was taken off the mountain and he got to regimental aid post, when they were doing the triage, they just left him to one side because they thought he's never going to make this. And after a lull happened, one of the medics was walking past him and just happened to see him move. So it's an incredible story of survival as well.
Oh, absolutely. But there's that element of what is there for those survivors, of those people who come back afterwards, and how they're treated. That, I guess, that was a big, second half or second act or whatever you call it in the film world that focused on. Yeah.
So looking at the ones you mentioned there as well, Simon, I think the Vietnam ones all stand out. And for me, Platoon, not only has it got a load of great lines, I think a lot of the lessons in Platoon are still applicable today. And the main one being is sort of toxic leadership. And you see it in the sort of the two of the platoon sergeants, Barnes and Elias. And I think it was Barnes is the scarred veteran with no moral compass. And as a young soldier, that's the one you sort of gravitate towards because he's the hardest. But looking back on it now, you realise that he was quite toxic as a leader and a malign influence on his platoon. And you tend to, as an older, I think, you start to gravitate to Elias, who was trying to do the right thing throughout some pretty harrowing moments in the film. Yeah,
and I guess in a way, partly these sort of Vietnam movies, Full Metal Jacket, Platoon, Apocalypse Now, even Good Morning Vietnam, I guess it just was a time. So they sort of came out while we were serving in the military. So it's something we're going to be interested in. But it was predominantly Americans in Southeast Asia. But we don't ever want to forget the Australian classic, The Odd Angry Shot. That must have been on heavy rotation, in our barracks. So I watched it so many times, and you're right. That's the look at the different types of leadership, but things like The Odd Angry Shot also showed some of those patrolling skills, and that actually it really got into what must it feel like to be there, probably more than some of the older films, which were more big screen epics in the view. These really got down, and I think it's a jungle as well. Jungles are by their nature dense and enclosing, and I think it brought that side to it as well. You really feel a part of it.
It's a film favourite of Kev's, that one, isn't it, mate?
Yeah, but I tell you, I need to reach back a little bit because one of my favourite films is Pork Chop Hill, which is Korea. With and again, it showed it was the late 50s, I think it was done. So it wasn't done too soon after the Korean truce, and it showed that it wasn't like a normal Second World War film. It did show all the faults, the failures, the wider political piece as well. And it's still one of my firm favourites. And it's also one of the first films where you had black soldiers fighting, because in the Second World War they weren't able to fight. It was only later there was like films about the American Air Force, but in the Korean War it was a different piece. And also it didn't give off an anti-war vibe. It was just about obviously fighting for a hill that they were going to give back anyway.
Yeah, and you saw later on, though, actually, that's a good point about the black troops, because by Vietnam was fought, they're all drafted, and it was predominantly uneducated black and white kids from the poorer parts of the states that got involved in that war.
Yeah, it couldn't beat the draft, who couldn't defer. But at the same time as the Vietnam films came out, obviously MASH was, although it was supposed to be focused on Korea, was a very anti-war, but it gave that view of the wars that were going on at the same time.
Mm.
And MASH is a classic.
Yeah,
I mean, although not a film. I mean, they did make a film.
They made a film as well, yeah.
And then the series, but an absolute classic film, MASH.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about the poor, less educated elements of the soldiers who fought in Vietnam and were showcased in the movies, and I think that's a really interesting point because I guess for people who were drafted into Vietnam, that's where a lot of the focus came on the story of these people, and even the officers and other ranks were to some degree in the same boat, in that the officers had come in quickly. It wasn't a kind of old stagers who's a military veteran who's been around for 15 years who is now leading on. It was quite often someone who didn't know what they were doing either, who's rocked up on the same boat as the guys. So
and you saw that in Platoon, didn't you? Where the platoon commander was weak and was dominated by Barnes, wasn't he?
I think as well, another thing that I guess always intrigued me slightly, especially with these sort of films as well, was we quite often got to see the before as well. So before they went to the big centerpieces of battles. So we'd see in a few of the films, you'd see the training sequence. Them actually going through boot camp, as it were, and what it was like in barracks back in the States before they were sent out. And, it was always full of the sort of cliched screaming drill sergeant, the whole
Full Metal Jacket,
break them down so we can build them up again. All of that kind of process.
Some great one-liners.
Yeah.
I mean, Full Metal Jacket, again, is the Saturday evening. Glass of something to drink.
But he was an actual gunnery sergeant.
It wasn't his part. Apparently, it wasn't his part. He just got the part in the end, and he made it his part, and then that's it. Because I think he was supposed to instruct the actor to play a gunnery sergeant.
Well, fact from the film here, in Full Metal Jacket, where the door gunner's shooting up the civilians in the fields, he was going to be the gunnery sergeant,
right?
And he got booted off because the Lee Ermey got the part of gunnery sergeant Hartman.
Yeah, and but also just too good.
But don't forget as well, the other thing that you tend to forget is, because we are getting on a bit now, but Vietnam, when we were in the troop, had only finished 13 years beforehand, and I remember going down on the LERP medics course at the LERP school in Weingarten.
Yeah.
And there was a couple of American SF medics there teaching who had served in Vietnam. So sticking needles into us and putting in IVs and getting taught the use of tourniquets, and these guys had done it in the jungles of Vietnam.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I guess that's part of it. Possibly for us is you do see a connection. Those people were still around. Likewise, for people who joined up in the 70s, they'd have been joining up at a time when there was still, Second World War or Korean veterans around them as well. So it did sort of bring a lot of things home. And I guess talking of these movies, there's Oliver Stone himself. So again, who directed Platoon? He served in Vietnam, and so there's that whole thing of I guess these creative types wanting to tell their story as well. This is what it was like for me. It's.
I think as well, the other film we haven't mentioned is Born on the 4th of July, which is based on the real story of Ron Kovich, I think, who was an American Marine who was shot in the back and became a paraplegic. And there's a brilliant scene in that film where he's in a bar playing pool and he's pissed out his head. And he starts complaining about the Vietnam War. And a guy who's playing at the next table comes across and calls him a pussy and said, I was at Iwo Jima with the Marines. And I think that highlights that sort of generational change where that Marine from Iwo Jima was involved in a war that was black and white, and that it was, without being too bland, it was good against evil with a definite aim. Whereas Kovich is in a wheelchair, paralysed against a war that's, let's just say, morally dubious, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of that whole, you could class it as gung ho or don't go. There was a there was that look of a lot of the Vietnam films. Do we want to portray all this action and heroism, or do we want to look at the reasons why? And I guess a lot of films, later on fed off that, killing fields and things like that, which were really looking at a deeper elements between some of these conflicts as well.
So it makes the World War II films, even the later ones, it's safer ground, less controversial.
Yeah,
you concentrate on the story and the character without the background politics that overhung it.
Yeah.
I think as well, it was glamorous to the uninitiated. War is glamorous.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. And to young men, and these days young women, they look at it and they see these films, and there's a glamour attached to them. And as you know, when you go in operations and it hits you for real, it's not very glamorous at all.
Yeah,
a lot of stagging on.
and I guess there's that. I think it's a human element. That thing of I can imagine people watching these sort of films and saying, "I wonder how I would cope. What would I be like in that situation?" So I think that appeals to a lot of people. They want to see how they would deal with something, or they imagine how they would. But
and I think we were like that, didn't we? Do you remember when any tour to Northern Ireland came up in the 80s? Because back in the 80s, before Up Granby, Northern Ireland was your only chance to get on operations, and people were knocking down the doors to get over to Northern Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, or I was going to say, now that might not be quite accurate timeline, but or building walls to.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Build a good wall.
Yeah.
Kind of private in jokes in a podcast.
Yeah. But there we go. No, but I've always found it really interesting as well, and I guess from the Vietnam, whether it's just a general chronological fact of life, but it's still giving in terms of movies. So you're now getting movies about old veterans from Vietnam, possibly more than you ever did from any other time. So, there's a Clint Eastwood Gran Torino where he's, an ex-vet who's having his car stolen by the hoodlums. He's in his 50s or so, 50s, 60s or so. And it's
an anti-hero as well.
Yeah.
Racist, isn't he?
Yeah. But it's kind of showing that, the psyche or the injured warrior or the trauma is now part of a theme of movies that are being made back in America of American life today, but they are reflecting on what caused our people to be the way they are.
And I think the other reason Vietnam movies are so successful is Vietnam had the best soundtrack going.
Definitely.
That music from the 60s. I mean, you look at all they had: Creedence Clearwater Revival, Hendrix. We went to the Gulf War in '91 and got Vanilla Rice. There is no justice.
But I guess then if you're going to talk about the music of it, then Good Morning Vietnam was an interesting
classic.
sort of sidebar, if you like. While there was conflict in that, that wasn't the be all and end all of the story. It was the story of a DJ serving in Vietnam and how he tried to raise morale and go against the starchiness of that backroom unit he was involved in. Yeah, great film.
The Americans are probably in Vietnam. You get job as a DJ or in Full Metal Jacket as a journalist on the front line.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things that always strikes me is how different that portrayal of conflict is because of the American influence. I mean, I remember in the Gulf, once we had gone through the breach and we were sort of head down, one of the next things I remember seeing was fleets and fleets of American vehicles carrying Coca-Cola vending machines, because it's part of, it just showed how different they are to us in a way. But there we go. But I guess for me, really, all these movies we watched and watching together, it's real part of, I guess, maintaining and growing the bond that we had in troop life. When we weren't out in the field, we were hanging out together watching these films, and there's a lot of these movies that some of the toughest times, when the RSM is going to be checking the areas the next day, that you need to have a bit of fun. And that was alleviated with, some lines from some of our favourite movies. So there's a few films that I've loosely put under "and now for something completely different," which really, aside from the military type movies, we also watched a lot. Classics like the Blues Brothers, even Die Hard, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, or The Italian Job. Some great movies, but one of the things that is a real memory for me, and I think it was Ferris Bueller's Day Off, it would have to be, was there was some general or something coming to visit camp in Dortmund, and it was a huge, all camp areas was going on, and the whole place was being swept to within an inch of its life. But up in a little room in the block, there was sergeants and warrant officers and troops of the OP troop, curtains drawn so no one could see, watching a movie. We're not going to be out there doing that. We're going to hide. And I always remember our sergeant major at the time sort of every so often go, shh, 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 they're coming, turn it down a bit, and then we could turn it back up and watch it. The movies really gave us a little sense of escape, I think.
No, I agree with that, mate. And I think those comedies as well, the quotability, used to get them on Exercise and all the rest of it. But the other things like Billy Connolly, that time his stand-up videos were doing the rounds as well. And I always remember, a few beers at night on a Friday watching him.
Yeah,
a
few beers.
Well, a couple of beers for you, Kev. Lots of beers for the rest of us.
Yeah. But it is. It was. It was. I mean, going back to when we went through selection, Colin, we Gaz had a comedy video that we watched all the time, and Toodly Woodly Daughter, and we
was that
watched.
Bottom?
Yeah, and we've just watched that constantly, and it was just a real icebreaker element. It allowed us to lighten up the mood wherever we were.
And I remember when you'd be out on Exercise, hanging out your backside, and maybe meet up at an RV, and instead of doing the password or the pass number, it'd be Toodly Woodly.
Yeah, and I can't think that that can't be discounted. The amount of the ability to raise morale or get you over a tough time was just that little bit of shared experience and a little bit of just something that gave you we're all into this together, and we're all we all singing from the same hymn sheet, really, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I always remember. I'm a big fan of the Blues Brothers and watched it so many times. And again, that's a quotable film par excellence. And I always remember in Northern Ireland, actually, when in South Armagh. So just I guess my last tour anywhere, really, and was in a brick, and we came together. Sort of, there was a bit of a chinwag going on, and four of us all got together. We all leaned in, and I was brick commander, and I sort of just looking around at all of these earnest faces, wanting to know what's going on, and I just couldn't resist it, and I just went, orange whip, 3 orange whips, a sort of Blues Brothers line, and it was probably some of the young lads are going, what the hell's he on about? But
to show your age there.
Yeah. But it's just one of those things where there's got to be something that breaks the ice a wee bit.
Kev, you any Kev's always going on about things like Get Carter, Serpico, and French Connection.
Because that was
Come on, mate, we can't let you get off without saying something about those films, because I know you love them.
Yeah, well, I think the 70s brought out some of the real gritty films. I think I sort of looked at the American sort of film industry, and because again Vietnam was on, so they couldn't really focus on war films as such unless they were of Second World War issue. So a lot of the old American detective cop films came out. You know, the gritty New York, some based on true stories like Serpico and Super Cops, and then obviously the fictional ones like Popeye Doyle in French Connection, which was absolute fun, and it still stands the test of time if people.
And I would say, mate, you were the Popeye Doyle of the troop.
But I wore a pistol on my ankle
and a trilby.
But they were just classic films. I just thought, and Get Carter again.
Yeah,
Of the time in the early 70s, Michael Caine, it was getting to be a big star, doing a gangster film in Newcastle.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
yeah,
classic.
I mean, I think you're right. I think the gritty element was a real factor. French Connection, obviously, a brilliant movie, but I wonder if part of it for ourselves as well, it's not so much that it was something we were likely to experience. We weren't in New York. We weren't in New York. We weren't in the police, sort of thing. But it's that being up against it, having to find your way through, deal with difficult situations. I think that's part of what resonates with us. But also, it's just really good movie making, isn't it?
Yeah, and Serpico and all that sort of stuff, and Popeye Doyle and all that. They were always on the outside of the norms. They were always operating against the system as well as trying to do the right thing in a sometimes bad way.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what appealed, wasn't it? It was that non-conformity.
Well, I remember one podcast, Simon. I used the term maverick to describe guys in the troop, and Kev said, "No, we can't use the term maverick. That makes it sound like I don't know what you said, Kev, but you know what I mean."
Yeah,
maverick comes across as a negative. I think it's almost like, but whereas unconventional.
Yeah.
When you you talk about people like Wingate, not comparing us to Wingate, but Wingate was not a maverick. He was enlightened, perhaps is more. But for the majority of the army, they used the term mavericks as a negative about the way he was trying to operate.
But I think MD on the outside looking in would have used the term maverick for us. But a quick one as well, going back to how use of lines that you're going about that. Orange Whip thing. I always remember on PT, it was a classic Carter line because they're always trying to beat each other. And there was always that, if somebody came in behind you, it'd be you're a big man, but you're out of shape. For me, it's a full-time job.
Yeah. But I guess as well, the cliche of a lot of, the cop movies, like you say, it's the slight outsider who always gets, called in and says, "I'll have your badge and I'll have your gun and you're out of here," sort of thing. And I guess with us, they gave us a badge eventually, but people are still trying to figure out how it should look as well. So I don't
nobody
know.
wanted to give us a gun, mate.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So we haven't got any desert island dits this time, Simon. What you got planned for the end of the pod?
Well, I thought, I guess because we've talked about books and movies now, and I suppose one thing missing is music, and I think there's been some classic movies, music made with a slight military element to them. We've talked about Vietnam, so there is the classic Vietnam, a great bit of Jamaican reggae. There's 19. Kev's favourite, In the Army Now by Status Quo, but
You've just ruined the street cred side.
Yeah, but
Who's Status Quo?
But are there any songs that stand out for you guys?
I'm going to go a little bit left of field. Back in the 80s when we were listening to all this stuff and watching all these films, it was all about the Happy Mondays, the sort of Manchester scene, New Order, and I think I was a bit of a secret hippie, and I always liked a bit of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, that sort of 60s stuff. So I'm going to pick Ohio. And it does have a tie-in to the what we've talked about, because it's about the National Guard shooting dead 4 students protesting against the Vietnam War at Kent State University. And I think as well, and a bit of the irony is that these kids protesting that got shot were probably unlikely ever to go to Vietnam because they could evade the draft. And I just read Chrissie Hynde's autobiography and didn't realise she was at Kent State when this happened, and one of the blokes that got shot was the boyfriend of one of her mates. So I do like a bit of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young and Neil Young, I've got to admit.
Cracking.
Kev, what are you picking?
Well, I went more on the classic war films. So I went back to the Battle of Britain, and it was the dogfight scene and the way that there was no sound apart from the orchestra, and it was called The Battle in the Air by Sir William Walton. But I just thought the way they captured the music and the action, it just gelled so well. And for me, whenever you see it or you hear that music now, you can picture the dogfight, and these some of them really young kids that did 20 hours training the Spitfire, and all of a sudden then they were thrown into the air to go and fight the Germans, who were far more experienced at air warfare.
Right, nice. Well, I guess I've stuck with some of my favourites, but I always think this is a bit of a movement away from the normal. So I'm a big Joy Division New Order fan, and New Order brought out some brilliant records, but one that struck me is an album track called Love Vigilantes, and Bernie, when he was writing, he said he wanted to do a bit of a redneck tune. He'd been listening to a bit of country, and he thought he'd try to do something. So he wrote this song, and it's essentially the story of a guy who's returning from a war that had to be won, and he's returning to his family, and basically he gets home, and as his wife opens the door, she falls down on the floor because the telegram in her hand says that I was a very brave man, but I was dead. And so it's this kind of, he just tells a little story of someone coming home, and he said he had no idea where the idea came from. He just ran it through, and it's very un-New Order-like, but the premise of the song is really great. You know, someone saying, "For my country I would die, and I will see it soon." You know, is a really moving element of what is kind of a jokey song, but a real great one. Yeah.
Coming from Manchester, though, mate, lots of back in the day there was like a war zone at times, so he's probably not far off of that experience.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, that's one of the things I always find interesting when you look back at, you know, and music's a great one for it, because, you know, there's all album covers or pictures of a band, and places like Manchester, Liverpool, and you know, I'm sure, you know, Glasgow, Birmingham. The amount of ruins and rubble and things like that, it was, you know, we were growing up when there was still a lot of
bomb sites.
Yeah.
Well, funny enough, I was talking to somebody the other day there about this, and I was saying that when you came back on leave from Germany in the 1980s, the contrast between the two countries was huge. You went from Germany, which is a well-ordered country, neat, tidy, you know, a really nice transport system, and you came back to the UK, and it just looked a dump. It was filthy. It was, the trains didn't run on time, and there was a huge contrast between the two countries.
Yeah, but they still didn't quite suss out how to stop squaddies jumping on trams without paying. But, you know, there you go.
But they did have the all-day drinking, right? And that was another contrast when you came back to the UK. The pubs were open 11 till 2, then shut till 5, and then open till 11. Yeah. You couldn't go down the laundry, then go in the pot for 12 hours in the UK at the time.
No, that was it. But, you know, that's you know, those cultural differences were, you know, an interesting one, because there was us. You tell us we can drink all day, we just go hammer and tongs. This is it. You know, was meant to be pacing ourselves and trying things out, but no, it was.
Well, I went back to Dortmund in 2005, and we left there in 93, I think it was. And I decided, I was there with a couple of guys from 12 Regiment, which was the regiment I was into before I came to troop. And we deliberately did a tour of all the bars that we struggled or couldn't get into. And I got chatting to one of the barmen there, and he said it was a bit bizarre. He's saying that, yeah, they didn't let us in because we behaved badly a lot of the time. But looking back on it, they didn't realise how much we brought to the local economy.
Yeah.
Oh, massive.
Yeah.
In Dortmund, God knows how many gunner regiments were there.
It was 5, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Plus all the dependents. There must have been like 5,000-6,000 Brits there, I think.
Yeah, that's a massive amount of money.
Yeah.
Employment.
Right, so thanks for coming on the pod, Simon. It's great to have you back on.
Thank you very much.
Cover next Christmas.
Thank you.
So, and also thanks again for listening, for your continued support and suggestions. And as usual, please keep them coming. And you can get it to us through our email and social media links, which are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us in all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you want to get in contact with Kev, you can send a pigeon or a Royal Mail letter. How much is a first-class stamp these days, Kev?
Yeah, I don't know. I just buy them. I just ask for first-class stamps. I hand over my card, and they give me stamps.
There we go, mate. So,
modern technology.
Tips for life. Modern technology.
That's modern, isn't it?
If you've downloaded us from iTunes and like the podcast, please leave us a review, or leave us a review where you get your podcasts. It's a great way of building up the audience. And thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing support and sponsorship to the series and offering technical support through his company ISARR. And we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.